Picture this. The year is 1431. You're 19 years old, locked in a stone tower in Rouen, France. You led an army. You crowned a king. You changed the course of a war. Now you're chained to a wooden block, guarded by 5 English soldiers who work in rotating shifts. They never leave you alone. Not when you sleep. Not when you eat. Not when you need privacy for basic human functions. Never. And here's what the trial records, the actual transcripts kept by the prosecution, reveal about what happened in those 4 months between your capture and your execution. This isn't speculation. This is documented evidence, preserved because your executioners were so confident in their righteousness that they wrote everything down. Let me walk you through what those documents actually say. January 3rd, 1431. Joan of Arc is transferred to a cell in Rouen Castle. The cell is described in the records. 8 feet by 10 feet, stone walls, 1 small window with iron bars, no heating despite midwinter temperatures. The trial transcript notes that she is placed in iron chains attached to a wooden beam, with 5 English soldiers assigned to constant guard duty. Constant guard duty. The records are very specific about this. The guards are never to leave her alone. They are to watch her at all times. Now, here's the question the trial records don't ask. But we have to. Why? She's already locked in a tower. She's already in chains. She's a 19-year-old girl, imprisoned in the middle of an enemy-controlled city. Why does she need 5 armed men watching her every second? Think about what that level of surveillance actually means. When you need to sleep, 5 men are watching. When you need to change clothes, 5 men are watching. When you need privacy for the most basic human functions, 5 men are watching. This isn't security. This is psychological torture. And it's documented. Not hidden, not secret. Written down in official trial records, as if it's perfectly normal. If you believe that the documented records of history's most devastating injustices must be remembered, consider liking this video and subscribing. Your support helps us uncover the truths that textbooks bury. Now, let me show you what happened next according to the trial transcripts themselves. February 21st, 1431. The trial begins. Joan is brought before a court of 131 judges, all men, all clergy, all aligned with England and Burgundy against France. The chief prosecutor is Pierre Chon, Bishop of Beauvais, a man who will be paid 765 livres by the English crown for securing a conviction. The transcripts of the trial sessions were recorded by 5 notaries. Multiple copies were made. Some were lost over the centuries, but enough survived that we can read the actual questions and answers. And here's where it gets disturbing. During one of the early sessions, Joan makes a request. It's recorded in the transcript of February 24th. She asks to be transferred to a church prison where she would be guarded by women instead of men. This was standard practice for female prisoners accused of religious crimes. Church law actually required it. The judges deny her request. No explanation given, just denied. She asked again on March 12th. Denied. March 17th. Denied. She asks 6 times according to the transcripts. 6 times she specifically requests to be moved away from the constant supervision of male soldiers. 6 times denied. Now here's what the trial records don't say directly, but what becomes clear when you read them carefully. Joan starts appearing at trial sessions in men's clothing. This becomes one of the central charges against her, that she refuses to wear women's clothing. But buried in the transcripts is her explanation, given during the session of March 3rd. She says she wears men's clothing for protection. The judges demand clarification. Protection from what? The transcript records that she refuses to answer and becomes visibly distressed. Think about what that means. She's a 19-year-old prisoner, chained in a cell, guarded constantly by 5 soldiers. She wears men's clothing for protection, but won't specify from what. What do you think she's protecting herself from? Later testimony, given after her death during the rehabilitation trial of 1456, provides the answer. A priest named Martin Ladvenu, who visited Joan in prison, testified. She told me she wore male clothing because she feared assault from the guards. The clothing was harder to remove. Read that again. She wore men's clothing, the very thing they would eventually execute her for, because the clothing was harder to remove by force. This is documented, stated explicitly in the 1456 testimony. But during the 1431 trial, she couldn't say it. She became visibly distressed and refused to answer. Why couldn't she say it? Because 5 of the men she was accusing were standing right there in the room, watching her, like they did every second of every day. How do you tell a court that your guards are assaulting you when your guards are standing behind you? The trial continues through March and into April. Joan is questioned about her visions, her voices, her military actions, her clothing, her faith. The transcripts show she's articulate, intelligent, theologically sophisticated. She runs circles around questions designed to trap her. At one point, asked if she knows whether she is in God's grace, she gives an answer so perfect that theologians still study it. If the first I am not, may God put me there. If the first I am, may God keep me there. It's a question designed to be unanswerable. If she says yes, she's guilty of pride. If she says no, she's admitting sinfulness. She finds the only possible response that avoids the trap. She's 19 years old, uneducated, imprisoned, chained, constantly watched, and she's outmaneuvering 131 trained theologians. So they change tactics. On May 2nd, she's taken from her cell to a torture chamber. The transcript records this. They show her the instruments, the rack, the strappado, the wheel. They tell her she'll be tortured unless she confesses. According to the transcript, she says, "Even if you tear my limbs from my body, I will not say anything different. And if I did say something different under torture, I would afterwards say that you forced me to say it." Think about that response. Even facing torture, she's strategically brilliant. She's not just refusing, she's preemptively invalidating any confession they might extract. She's telling them that torture won't work because she'll immediately recant and blame them. At 19 years old, imprisoned for 4 months, facing the rack, she's still thinking 3 moves ahead. They don't torture her that day. The transcript notes that the judges decide torture is unnecessary. But here's what changes after that session. According to later testimony from Jean Massieu, one of the trial officials, the guards are instructed to increase pressure. What does that mean? Massieu doesn't specify in his testimony. But 2 days after the torture chamber session, Joan appears at trial with visible bruising on her face and arms. The transcript doesn't mention the bruises. The judges don't ask about them. But multiple witnesses from the 1456 rehabilitation trial testified that they saw them. Guillaume Manchon, one of the notaries recording the trial, testified, "I saw marks on her face and neck that had not been there in previous sessions." The trial moves toward its conclusion. By mid-May, the verdict is inevitable. The judges have decided she's guilty. The only question is whether she'll confess or die defiant. On May 24th, they take her to the cemetery of Saint-Ouen. A scaffold has been erected. A crowd has gathered. She's told she'll be burned immediately unless she signs a confession. She's 19 years old. She's been imprisoned for nearly 5 months. She's exhausted, brutalized, terrified. She signs. The transcript records that she makes her mark on a document of abjuration, a confession, and renunciation of her previous claims. In exchange, she's told she'll be transferred to a church prison, guarded by women, and will serve a life sentence instead of execution. She's taken back to her cell in the tower. But here's what happens next, and this is where the documented evidence reveals the full horror of what was done to her. She's not transferred to a church prison. She's taken back to the same cell, the same chains, the same 5 guards. According to testimony from Martin Letvenu and others during the rehabilitation trial, here's what happened over the next 3 days. The guards took her women's clothing, the clothing she was supposed to wear as part of her abjuration. They took it and left her only men's clothing in. When she asked for women's clothing, they refused. According to Jean Massieu's testimony, She told me the guards took her dress during the night while she slept. When she woke, she had only male clothing available. So she had a choice: remain naked, or wear the men's clothing she had just sworn not to wear. She wore the men's clothing, and that act, wearing men's clothing after abjuring, became the justification for her execution. On May 28th, the judges visit her cell and discover she has relapsed into her heresy by wearing men's clothing again. The transcript records their shock, their disappointment, their righteous anger, but buried in the rehabilitation testimony is what Joan told Martin Ladvenu when he visited her that day. She told him the guards had assaulted her. She told him that's why they took her dress. She told him she wore men's clothing because it was the only way to protect herself. Ladvenu testified to this explicitly in 1456. But in 1431, this explanation doesn't appear in the trial transcript, because the judges didn't ask. They didn't want to know. They had their relapse. They had their justification. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc is burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. She's 19 years old. The executioner is given specific instructions, documented in multiple contemporary accounts. He's told to build the pyre very high, so high that he can't reach her quickly to strangle her before the flames take her. As was customary for condemned prisoners, to reduce suffering, she's meant to burn alive, fully conscious, for as long as possible. Geoffrey Tirage, the executioner, testified years later that he'd never been given such instructions before. Usually, executioners were told to be merciful. Not this time. Contemporary accounts describe her death. I won't detail the physical suffering, you can imagine it. But what strikes me as most revealing is what happened afterward. The English authorities ordered her ashes to be collected and thrown into the Seine River. Not buried, not left in the marketplace, thrown into the river so that no relics could be gathered, so that no shrine could be built. They wanted to erase her completely. But here's what they couldn't erase: their own trial records. The transcripts they kept so carefully, so meticulously, because they thought they were documenting righteous justice. Those records survived, and when the rehabilitation trial examined them 25 years later, the truth started to emerge. Not the full truth, many of the witnesses were dead or afraid to speak, but enough to know that Joan asked 6 times to be transferred to a church prison with female guards. Enough to know she wore men's clothing for protection from guards who watched her constantly. Enough to know she was shown bruises that appeared between sessions. Enough to know her dress was taken from her in the night after she signed the abjuration. Enough to know she told a priest she'd been assaulted. The rehabilitation trial of 1456 nullified the conviction. It declared Joan of Arc innocent. It acknowledged that the trial had been corrupt. But here's what it didn't do. It didn't name the guards. It didn't prosecute anyone for what happened in that cell. It didn't even explicitly state what everyone reading the testimony could clearly infer, because naming it would mean acknowledging that the English crown, the church, the judges, everyone involved had allowed a 19-year-old prisoner to be systematically brutalized for 4 months. And that truth was too damaging to state directly. So it was buried, softly, gently, behind phrases like inappropriate conduct and lack of proper supervision. For 600 years, that's how the story was told. Joan of Arc, Virgin Martyr, Saint Hero of France. The part about the 5 guards and the chains and the constant surveillance and the stolen dress and the men's clothing worn for protection, that part was mentioned in scholarly footnotes, if at all, until recent historians started reading the trial transcripts more carefully, started asking uncomfortable questions, started connecting the documented facts that were always there but never assembled into a clear narrative. And now we know. Joan of Arc didn't just die for her faith or her visions or her defiance. She died because she was a woman who claimed authority in a world where women weren't allowed to have it. And the men who imprisoned her made sure she understood exactly what happened to women who forgot their place. They brutalized her. They humiliated her. They set a trap using her own dress as bait, and then they burned her for falling into it. all documented, all recorded, all preserved in the trial records that her executioners thought would justify them. Here's what haunts me about this story. Joan of Arc became a saint. She became a national hero. She became a symbol of courage and faith. But the 5 guards who watched her every second of every day, we don't even know their names. The men who took her dress in the night, no record. The officials who denied her requests for transfer 6 times, most are remembered as respectable church authorities. The system that put a 19-year-old girl in chains and surrounded her with armed men who brutalized her until she broke, that system was never questioned, never dismantled, never even acknowledged, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that Joan's execution wasn't about heresy or visions or men's clothing. It was about power, and what happens to women who challenge it. The trial records are still available. You can read them yourself, in French or English translation. Look for the moments where Joan refuses to answer, where she becomes visibly distressed, where she requests transfer and is denied without explanation. Look for the testimony from the rehabilitation trial about the guards and the dress and the bruises. It's all there. It's always been there. It was just buried under the more comfortable narrative of the virgin warrior saint who died for her faith. Because that story is inspiring. That story is clean. The real story about what actually happened to a 19-year-old prisoner in a locked cell with 5 guards and no protection, that story is disturbing. So, for 600 years we told the inspiring version. But the truth doesn't disappear just because it's uncomfortable. It waits in trial transcripts for someone to read carefully. It waits in rehabilitation testimony for someone to ask why. It waits in the documented facts that were always visible, but never assembled. And eventually, it emerges. Not because we're braver than previous generations. Not because we're more moral, but because someone decided that the questions Joan wouldn't answer deserved investigation. Someone noticed that she asked 6 times for female guards and was denied 6 times. Someone connected the dots between men's clothing for protection and guards who never left her alone. And slowly, the real story came into focus. This is what happened to Joan of Arc in the 4 months before her execution. Not speculation, not theory. Documented fact, preserved by the very people who thought they were recording righteous justice. They wrote it all down, they just didn't realize what they were confessing to. And now, 600 years later, we can read it. We can see what they did. We can see how they justified it. We can see how they erased it from the narrative while leaving it in the records. We can see the system that destroyed a 19-year-old girl and then made her a saint. As if sainthood erases brutalization. As if martyrdom justifies what happened before the fire. Joan of Arc was burned at the stake on May 30th, 1431. But she was broken 4 months earlier in a locked cell by men whose names we don't even remember. And that's the part they don't teach in school. If this exposed something you've never heard before, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're going to keep uncovering the documented evidence that historians buried. Drop a comment with your thoughts about what this reveals about power, justice, and the stories we choose to tell. I'll see you in the next investigation into the truths that shaped our world.